So this is our first snippet for this week, which is going to look at the Eisenhower administration. One of the things that I think distinguishes Eisenhower from contemporary environment, this is the Eisenhower approval rating for his presidency. So the orange is approval, the blue is disapproval. You'll note that he's in office for 8 years, and far more Americans approve of him than disapprove of him throughout. I mean, this is a different political era. So here you have this World War II hero. He runs as the Republican presidential nominee in 1952. The sense is that he's relatively moderate. But no one really knows what his opinions are because he had never run for public office before. In terms of foreign policy, in terms of domestic policy, Eisenhower basically accepts the New Deal with slight limitations. In terms of foreign policy, Eisenhower's key goal is to find ways to wage the Cold War without what he believed was the excessive expenditures of the Truman administration. He is a person who's willing to make political compromises. This is an infamous photograph. He's campaigning in 1952 in Wisconsin, which then, as well as now, was a swing state. His advisors told him it was important that he appear not to be anti-McCarthy, and so he shakes McCarthy's hand. This came this photo just after McCarthy had denounced George Marshall, Truman's Secretary of Defense, but also Eisenhower's commanding general during World War II. So Eisenhower knew what an awful person McCarthy was, but nonetheless, he's willing. So, as with any successful politician, he makes compromises. Eisenhower has two sort of key aspects in terms of making U.S. foreign policy less expensive. The first is to prioritize nuclear weapons over conventional weapons on grounds that nuclear weapons are more efficient fiscally. And the idea here would be to deter Soviet aggression with the knowledge that the United States would launch a significant attack. This is a doctrine sometimes called massive retaliation. It's not a doctrine that kind of works in the long term, but Eisenhower is able to reduce defense spending by around a third while he's in office. The second is to use in areas where nuclear threats would not be successful, to use covert operations. The man on the left here is Allen Dulles, who was the CIA director under Eisenhower, whose brother, coincidentally, was the Secretary of State. And there were two early covert actions by Eisenhower. The first is in Iran, where tensions had emerged between the Shah, who was more or less pro-American, and the leader of the Iranian parliament, a guy named Mohammad Mossadegh, who is perceived as more nationalist. The sense among Americans is that Mossadegh's desire to obtain Iranian control of Iranian oil suggested dangerous degrees of leftist nationalist sympathies, which must be eliminated. And so the U.S. comes up with this complicated plan to sort of foment a rebellion in Iran, and then to consolidate power with regards to the Shah. And this is sort of what occurs. This is Vice President Nixon welcoming the Shah to the United States after the coup. There is, however, a good deal of dispute as to just how significant U.S. involvement was in this coup. Mossadegh had made a lot of enemies with the Iranian military, elements of the Iranian political system. He was not exactly an egalitarian type in terms of sharing power. And the U.S. involved, the U.S. plan was so ham-handed. The idea was to sort of, have the army come to the Shah's rescue. The Shah flees during the middle of the operation to Rome. He was no profile in courage. And I think in retrospect, this is a situation where probably the U.S. involvement was not determinative. That is, that if Eisenhower had simply done nothing, Mossadegh would have been sidelined anyway. In the aftermath of the coup, he's removed as prime minister. He's placed under house arrest. He's never seen in public again. He passes away in 1957. Nonetheless, the impression here is that U.S. covert operations succeeded in installing the Shah in a more authoritative position. There will continue to be an Iranian parliament right up through the Iranian Revolution in 1979, but power tilts very much towards the Shah. So if in Iran, the U.S. was more sort of huffing than actual policy, sort of rhetoric rather than doing anything. That's not the case in Guatemala, where U.S. involvement was determinative. And in terms of analysis, I think as a general matter, it's probably a good idea to stay away from moral judgments, positive or negative, about U.S. foreign relations. But the U.S. response to events in Guatemala in the 50s is, it's right up there in terms of immoral policy initiatives. So the backdrop here is that in 1944, a dictatorship had been overthrown by a kind of broad-based democratic revolution in Guatemala, which is a country that really had never had a democratic government before this time. This is in the era of World War II. The United States is promoting democracy. It's hard for Latin American militaries to sort of remain in place. And a kind of moderate leader, an academic named Juan Jose Arevalo, is elected president. They rewrite the Constitution. The president will serve a single 6-year term, and Arevalo does so. The government is centered left. There's a little bit of land reform. There's support for democratic systems. It's not an anti-American government by any means. This is a map which is promoted by during the Eisenhower administration, showing how Guatemala is allegedly a threat to the United States because it's only 1,000 miles from New Orleans. But in any case, U.S. relations with Arevalo's government are pretty good. In 1950, he leaves office according to the Constitution. He is replaced in an election overwhelmingly by his defense secretary, a man named Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz is much more leftist than this is a billboard from Guatemala at the time celebrating Arbenz's land reform proposals. Arbenz is much more left-wing than Arevalo was. I think the best single book on this by a historian named Piero Gleijeses argues that Arbenz was a secret member of the Communist Party, which was an indigenous communist party, so this was not a kind of Stalinist plot. And Arbenz enacts a very aggressive land reform program, basically confiscating land owned by U.S. corporations, the most famous of which is the United Fruit Company, later rebrands under Chiquita, all kinds of banana and fruit fields. And what UFCO had, its acronym is UFCO. What UFCO had done was to dramatically underreport the value of its properties on its Guatemalan taxes, and so Arbenz responds by paying them what they declared their value under the taxes, and then UFCO says, "Well, our land was actually much more valuable." And when Eisenhower takes over, the argument by UFCO and by other critics of the regime that this is a dangerous communist government. Even though Arbenz is a secret member of the Communist Party, no one knows this publicly, and the Soviets don't really pay any attention to Guatemala, and that the U.S. needs to involve itself. And the result is a coup in which the U.S. and the CIA basically creates the impression that the United States is about to invade Guatemala. This is in 1954. They drop leaflets in the capital city. They assemble a kind of ragtag liberation army on the border in Honduras. And the goal is to sort of encourage the Guatemalan army to get rid of Arbenz, and this is exactly what happens. Arbenz, to some extent, loses his will. His hope is that if he resigns, the army, which he believes is largely sympathetic, will be allowed to take over, and this doesn't work out. Instead, the U.S. installs a kind of puppet regime. But on the dying days of the Guatemalan regime, the Guatemalans go to the United Nations, hoping for assistance. And this is a movie tone reel, so this is kind of it's TV news didn't exist at the time, so they would do these snippets that they would show people in movies. Here's how the issue was playing out.
Confronted by the greatest crisis since the communist invasion that caused the Korean War, the United Nations Security Council, with Henry Cabot Lodge as president, sits in extraordinary session. A Sunday convocation that hears Guatemala's chief delegate allege that his country is the victim of international aggression, though the facts show that the rebellion now disturbing Central America is one conducted by patriotic anti-red Guatemalans, which inspires Russia to air the worn-out charge that the U.S. created the trouble, although the Guatemalan, to Mr. Lodge's satisfaction, absolved the U.S.
I'm very glad that the Guatemalan representative made it crystal clear that he makes no charge whatever against the United States government.
The Kremlinite then hears this warning.
Representative of the Soviet Union, stay out of this hemisphere, and don't try to start your plans and your conspiracies over here. Translation.
It's not exactly an unbiased news coverage. In fact, but the Guatemalans are worried that if they openly accuse the U.S., that will just trigger a U.S. intervention. They're trying to thread a needle, but ultimately they fail to do so. This is just a disastrous U.S. Policy. The result will be a lengthy civil war in Guatemala, all kinds of human rights abuses by the government. So it's a reminder that yes, in theory, Eisenhower's use of covert operations was cheaper, but it came with significant costs. This, as I mentioned earlier, Eisenhower does succeed in reducing defense spending during his time in office, which is an impressive achievement and is extremely rare during any point in the Cold War. So basically, more expensive conventional forces are cut, less expensive nuclear weapons expand. One other crisis during the middle stages of the Eisenhower administration, in 1953, Stalin dies, and eventually this man, Nikita Khrushchev, takes over as head of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev was what passed for a moderate figure in the context of Soviet political culture in the 1950s. He wants to kind of move beyond the Cold War. Not so much beyond the Cold War, but into a less tense environment. He's also extremely erratic, however, so it's a sort of bad combination. And he also wants to move beyond Stalinism. He concludes correctly that Stalinism is poisonous for the fate of the sort of Soviet system. So in 1956, he summons the leadership of the Communist Party and the leadership of the communist parties in Eastern Europe to Moscow and delivers a speech in which he denounces what he calls the cult of personality that had formed around Stalin, and says that this is not appropriate with Marxism-Leninism. This is supposed to be a private remark. It comes to be known as the secret speech. Of course, any such speech it's going to leak out. What Khrushchev is doing is trying to distance himself from Stalinism. What he does not anticipate is that since most of the leaders of Eastern Europe are Stalinist, this has the effect of basically Khrushchev denouncing them, and it kind of undermines them at home. And the most significant of these, there are a series of uprisings that occur in the aftermath of this in East Germany and Poland, but the most significant comes in Hungary, where there was more of a democratic base than in any other East European country except for Czechoslovakia. And in the fall of 1956 in Budapest, the capital, these are some photos, there's a popular uprising, a statue of Stalin is toppled, a reform communist named Imre Nagy takes over. He agrees to the formation of non-communist governments, non-communist political parties, calls for a coalition government, says that he's going to pull Hungary out of the Warsaw Pact and be neutral in the Cold War, ask the Soviets to agree to his permission. The Soviets say that they will do so. They pull their troops out of Budapest, but they're actually just pulling them out to recalibrate them. They move back in. They eventually will arrest and execute Nagy. And this move, the Hungarian invasion of 56, basically ends any idea that there's any kind of popular legitimacy to these East European communist regimes. But there's also an element of frustration here. The Eisenhower administration, through the Voice of America, this new propaganda, news and propaganda radio station, had encouraged the Hungarians to revolt. And yet when they did revolt, the United States didn't do anything to help them. So it was almost as if these civilians were sort of pawns in the system. Soviets installed a very hard line government in Hungary. The leader, a man named János Kádár, will govern Hungary right up until the eve of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. So that is our first set of snippets for this week.